Hello and welcome, everyone, to the IUCN Bear Specialist Group, North American Bear Expert Team webinar series. We want to welcome NABIT committee members as well as BSG members in attendance today. I think most everyone knows that the Western Black Bear Workshop scheduled for next week in Wyoming has been canceled. I did not know that. It is set to take place this time next year in 2024. Today's webinar is the third in 2023. Remember, we'll take June and July off since most members will be in the field and get back to it in early fall. If anyone here would like to get signed up to give a presentation between August and November, please get in touch with Rich or Chris Servine at your convenience. So let's get started. Today's presentation, titled Long-Term Research on Black Bear Denning Ecology in the North Cascades by Rich Beausoleil and Lindsay Welfelt. As always, we'll finish today's webinar about 1 hour to respect everyone's time. And don't forget that I've lost my intro.
Okay, no worries, Mike.
Nope.
Sorry, I shared my screen there.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm back. And don't forget, you can use the chat function to ask questions at any time or wait until the end. It's up to you. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, and non-presenters should mute their microphones, turn off the cameras to preserve bandwidth. With that said, we want to welcome Rich and Lindsay. Take us to the North Cascades of Washington.
Thanks a bunch, Mike. You guys are seeing the right screen, right?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Long-term research on black bear denning ecology in the North Cascades with myself and Lindsay Welfelt, both from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Here's a look at bear habitat in Washington. Everything that you see there in green is the forested areas of Washington. Roughly about 20,000 black bears live in Washington. You do see in the hash marks the 2 grizzly bear recovery areas in Washington, but only the Selkirk in the Northeast Washington has a confirmed population, which is why today's talk is only focused on black bears. The area we worked in on this 10+ year project was not occupied by grizzly bears. Just a quick brief look at some of the research in Washington with black bears. You can see outside of food habits and tree damage, habitat use and home range, survival. Not a lot of work has been done with modern techniques using to estimate density or to obtain reproduction and growth rates until we began this work that we're talking about here today. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, so just a quick background slide. You can see these are our overall project objectives, where denning ecology is just really one portion of the large-scale black bear project in the North Cascades. But we marked a lot of bears for this project and visited a lot of dens. So the project was initiated in 2013, and these 10 topics are our objectives. Along with that, we developed a statewide density monitoring protocol, which we are not going to be talking about today, but it's a pretty big presentation in itself. But so far, we'll just quickly mention we've worked in 14 study areas since 2019 as a collaboration with some local tribes. And that effort continues until we start work this summer.
Okay, here's our study areas shown in the stars in a brief overview of Washington. Although they were not very far apart, these study areas were very, very different. We felt like these 2 study areas represented much of the habitat that we see in the North Cascades. And this line that you see, this is pretty much the Cascade crest, the shadow as they call it locally, which separates the western part, which is very wet, with the eastern part, which is actually very dry. On the west side study area, it averaged about 137 centimeters of rain annually. And on the eastern part, it averaged about 60 centimeters. So the habitat types were very different. And this was, as Lindsay mentioned, our study duration, 2013 to 2023. We trapped until 2019, and when GPS collared more than 300 bears that were captured about 400 times. And we investigated more than 400 dens in this time. So data analysis is really just starting. GPS collars were removed this past winter. We phased into that a year ago and finished it up this year. And so now everything is uncollared.
Yeah, so just because we just finished all that work, we haven't really analyzed a lot of the data yet. So this presentation is very much going to be focused on kind of an overview view of the project, some interesting observations and lessons learned from that. Not a super analytical project here.
For folks that are joining us from other countries and may not be familiar with black bear's annual cycle in the Pacific Northwest, this is what we found. The bear's annual variation in behavior allowed us to partition our data collection activities. Spring and summer was focused on trapping after den emergence, but then avoiding those fall hunting seasons, as you see. And then after den entry, we were focused on den work, which was, of course, triggered by a combination of dwindling food sources, length of day, temperature, and of course, safety and growth for the newborns. Go ahead, Linz.
Yeah, so as probably everyone here knows, you know, in order to survive those months without food, bears will lower their body temperatures, recycle nutrients, and break down fat stores gained throughout, especially that fall period. So they're not readily losing muscle mass or bone mass during hibernation, unless they're in very poor condition and their fat stores have been depleted. But for a research perspective, bear hibernation and denning allows us to not only learn about denning ecology, but also collect information and mark bears when they're in one location for a long time. So as Mike Proctor was talking about before this presentation started, it's very hard to retarget the same bears. So if they're in a den in the winter, it's a lot easier to find them again and recollar those same animals.
So a little bit, oops, sorry about that. A little bit about our captures methods. Of course, we had to capture them first to put those collars on. We primarily used the leg hold snares, Aldrich spring activated. As you can see on the top left, we built trail sets and cubby sets. We physically checked those traps every single day, but we also utilized trap transmitters after a couple years into the project. So we were literally responding to captures day and night, which was very demanding, but also very rewarding because animals really were not in traps for extended periods of time. We were never more than, an hour away at any given time. Sporadically and opportunistically, we also used culvert traps and Karelian bear dogs to tree and capture bears. So anything and everything while we were out there was an active capture effort. Of course, getting capture efforts were the first step in getting this underway. Those GPS collars, even though it's great technology, it does have some limitations. We received 4 locations per day, and collars were equipped with mortality and hibernation functions. And we use those cotton spacers that you see on the left as a weak link in case of collar failure. But as many folks in attendance today know, all of this technology really only gets you so close. You do get a location and snowmobiles can get us close, but it always involves hiking and snowshoeing and VHF telemetry to actually pinpoint that location, because they could have went in the den and you didn't get it, 3 hours ago, and you didn't get that exact location. So there is a little bit of work to do. Anything else on that, Linz?
Yeah, no, I just would say it a number of times too, they'll kind of make their den beforehand and then go move around and then they'll go to the den just straight away. And so you don't kind of get that localization right by the den a lot of times.
Yeah. And then of course with snowmobiles, they're not on groomed trails most of the time, like you see in that photo on the right. Sometimes you got to blaze your own trail, and that was literally created that morning. And then of course, challenging conditions like many mountainous areas have. Real steep terrain and avalanches were a daily concern in the North Cascades. So we had to carry beacons and probes and shovels and just continually monitor weather conditions. We also carried ropes like you see in that third photo from the left, for real steep areas and near cliffs, and always had to be ready for really highly variable weather conditions like freezing rain, which can sometimes turn you around. We actually chose not to work up bears in those conditions. And so you can wind up making multiple trips to one den. Go ahead on this one, Lindsay.
Yeah, so sometimes dens presented a little bit trickier situations than others. So in some situations, we needed to use climbing gear. One case, we actually toted a ladder in on the back of my snowmobile, and then climbed up the ladder into the den. Sometimes those big cottonwood trees are just too dangerous to climb. And so we actually used the ladder in that case. You can see, I think, my face sticking out at the top of the ladder up there. But just really, you never really knew what you were going to find, especially if it was a den you've never been to before. And so we had to be really prepared for really any type of structure or any conditions. So that was a very challenging part of it.
And here's a couple of ways that we monitored reproduction. On the left there, that's just an example of a camera. We typically placed 3 around the den just to get multiple angles and be able to count cubs. And then on the right there, those are actual immobilizations to recollar the female, but also to collar the yearlings that were there. Den visits, as most of you know, we feel this way that is probably one of the most invasive things we can do, but vitally important if it's needed for a management focused project like ours. And regardless of which technique we were using, we always really were in stealth mode around dens, walking in the last 50 yards without any snowshoes, wearing clothes that doesn't make noise when you brush up against it, kind of that swishing noise. And then of course, when you're digging into those dens, doing so real carefully and slowly. Sometimes just being able to count cubs and hang cameras and walk away was great. So that we'll talk more about this as we go along in the presentation. So here's an example of counting cubs with a pretty large female. Go ahead and play this video so you can see it. But you know, when you set them back a little bit off the den, you can really get good images and making it pretty easy to count these cubs. And if we did lose one, we were assuming a 50-50 sex ratio. I will say that. Here's another example. It wasn't unusual for females to go in and out of the dens, especially when they first emerged, like this one is doing. And before they departed the den for good with the cubs, the adult female typically came out, replaced bedding material, and started drinking water. You could see all those fresh clippings around. They were replacing that stuff and eating a little bit of it too. So there's another look at it. And then here's the situation, the same female, but with a different litter. And this time 3 cubs instead of 2. One climbing on the back there. And then here's a family that's literally just about to depart the den for good. You can see cubs being a lot more active, getting in trouble, just mom's ready to call it a season there. But you can document some pretty cool behaviors. And then here's a yearling example. This tree actually presented some challenges because of its age. You see that mom going up and the yearling going up. This was not one that was safe to climb for us, and it would have created a lot of disturbance because of all of that mistletoe that was up there. And so we chose not to collar this bear. But we knew from cameras the previous year that she had one cub. And from this video, we learned that the cub survived. Go ahead, Linz. Can't hear you.
Yeah, so darting bears in the den. Trying to dart a bear in the den is not really easy. So obviously first, because it requires a lot of contortion to get in there. Second, the bear is aware of you the whole time that you're there. And then third, because a lot of the openings are very small. Like a lot of the time, it's like, how does this bear even fit through this hole if I can hardly fit through it? So you have to stick your face right in the den. And then we usually dart right when she looks at us. So you can see on the right, sometimes you can get a shot without getting too close. But in these situations, you really need to know your dart gun very well, especially if there's cubs in there with them. Make sure you're hitting the right spot on the bear. And then in cases where yearlings were present, instead of setting up cameras, we immobilized either a single bear or we would or collar the whole family if there are yearlings present.
Keep going.
So after all the bears were immobilized, so then we would go into the dens and remove the bears. Sometimes we didn't remove all the bears. So a lot of times if we had a female with yearlings, we would just remove the yearlings, or if it was a smaller bear. A lot of times the larger bears, we didn't want to pull them out unless we were sure that we could get them back in the den. So that was a pretty big consideration on whether or not we pulled bears out of the den. So if we did remove yearlings from the den, we would just place them on insulated tarps to keep them insulated from the snow or the wet ground. And then we would go in there and replace the mom's collar. Sometimes we would remove all of the bears, but again, we would make sure that that was a situation where we could get everybody back in the den. And then regardless of what we did when we were done going into the den, we put all bears back in there, and then we use branches and or snow to close up the entrance and leave it as we found it. We are trying to reduce the disturbance as much as possible.
Yeah, and a lot of times you'll see when you arrive at some of these dens and it's later in the year, you might see an entrance in one spot that might have a little bit of an opening, and then I call it a chimney in the back of it. In those cases, we left it as we found it and tried to keep those same openings because it was likely, some beneficial airflow that was, designed to be that way, is my guess by the bears. So when we did recollar the females and collared yearlings, this is typically what it looked like, so that we could gather information on survival of young bears, dispersal of the males. Immobilization order was crucial in these situations. We always did mom first and then backed off for 10 minutes or so, waited for her to become sedated, and then immobilized the yearlings. We'll talk a little bit about that. You can do that just by hand. Some examples of what we collected, we had probably 15 or 20 measurements there. Ear tags, collars, sex ID, condition. See the middle photo showing you the variation in size and coloration of bears. And as anyone who's collared bears know, you have to carry multiple size collars with you in the field to be able to customize that fit. Is just not clean. So packs tend to be full and heavy. And it just takes a lot of preparation that we're trying to get everybody to understand if you decide to do this work.
So although we mentioned that typically we would always set up cameras at dens of females with newborn cubs, so we were trying to avoid handling any newborn cubs. We had other researchers that had worked in Washington before that had quite a few den abandonments, and so we were very concerned about that. And so that was why we avoided it as much as possible, especially if it's a female's first litter. We felt like it was more likely that she would abandon her cubs. And so although we did try to avoid it as much as possible by just using cameras, there were some situations where we did have to handle cubs. So it was, you know, sometimes the cubs were born earlier than expected. Sometimes the female was young and she had a litter before we expected, or sometimes we just weren't able to recapture that female before she had her cubs. And so we did have to go in. In those situations, we, you know, sexed the cubs, often took weights, but just really tried to keep them as warm as possible while we collared the adult female, and then got out of there as soon as we could.
Yep. And then sometimes it was just important to get the bear, depending on when you captured it, on cycle for that 2-year replacement, because the batteries were programmed to last for 2 years. And so you may need to go in that first year, document, you know, replace the collar so that it's on the right schedule so that you're not disturbing newborns. Here's another video example. Hopefully this will work here so that you can hear.
No, no sound.
Okay, sorry about that. That didn't work. I'm having some problems on my computer with voice, so I'm actually signed in twice here, so I'm sure it has to do with that. So anyway, those were some cub vocalizations. And then some of our findings, as far as, you know, there was I'm going to just call it a myth that some black bears did not den in Washington, in Western Washington. And we found that all the black bears we collared did den in Washington. Females mostly denned October to April, but the longest we recorded was mid-September to early May. And of course, males den for shorter periods of time. Any other points there, Lindsay?
Yeah, so and I would like keep in mind too that a lot of the areas that we were working, especially in Western Washington, are pretty urbanized. So we were not very far outside of the city of Seattle in a lot of those situations. So you know, one of these females that denned, you know, mid-September to early May was actually, you know, a 300+ pound female that had plenty of access to human foods. And she actually was one of our longest hibernators, which was something that was pretty interesting. I would say in general, bears in Western Washington, which was warmer and wetter, denned shorter periods of time than those in our Eastern Washington study area, which tended to be higher elevation and more covered in snow. But that was not always the case.
Yeah, good point. So here's what we found, that the earliest we recorded reproduction was at 4, but generally bears were 5 years old, but we did have numerous examples of 6, 7, and 8 years old being the first reproduction. So, you know, if you're monitoring growth rate and you're counting on it being 4 or 5, you can really overestimate growth. As many folks on this call have in attendance here tonight have reported, bears are among the least productive of mammals in North America, you know, late to breed, and cubs every other year. We did document as bears move towards senescence, it was common for them to reduce litter size back to 1, which was real common for their first litter, especially 4-year-olds. We did document litters of 3, never more than that, but 2 was the most common, and it wasn't always necessarily tied with fitness. Yearlings separated from their mom as most do before the breeding season in July, but males didn't usually disperse until they were about 2.5 years old. And we did not document any long distance female dispersals. Talking a little bit about the structures that we observed, here's some examples of stumps. Stumps were the most common type found in Western Washington. It's similar to other research areas like British Columbia and Canada. These old growth stumps were predominantly preferred and offered considerable protection. Many of these trees were 200 to 400 years old, just incredibly impressive trees. Makes you harken back to what these forests probably looked like prior to settlers arriving. They were cut probably 100 to 120 years ago, and they won't be here forever. I mean, they're rotting away, and they're not being replaced with current forest management techniques. It's anywhere to from a 40 to 60 year rotation on private timber lands, a little bit longer for DNR and Forest Service, but these are definitely not anything we're going to see again. So some management recommendations for sure in the making with stumps. Go ahead, Linz.
Yeah, so standing trees were also pretty common den structures. Some of the dens were just in hollowed out cavities up inside the tree. And a lot of these were created by lightning strikes, wind damage, lost limbs, or fire damage. Some of the den structures and standing trees were at the base of the tree, just kind of underneath the roots. Some of the trees were dead, some of them were alive, so there was a lot of variability in this type of den structure.
And then here's some examples of fallen tree den structures. Sometimes it was inside, sometimes it was under, sometimes it was in an overhang created by the fallen tree. In the top left, that's kind of a visually deceptive picture. So here's the ground where you would be standing right here, and just peeking around this corner, you know, there's a bear down inside that tree 8 to 10 yards. It looks like we're above it looking down, but we're actually not. So fallen trees were also very, very important. And as you can see from those, it looks very similar, like they could all be the same tree, but they're not. Those are all different structures, and probably the second most important.
So ground dens were very, very much more common in Eastern Washington. We rarely ever saw them in Western Washington. So in Eastern Washington, water tables are lower, the soils are much drier, and also most of the precipitation is in the form of snow. So you're not getting a lot of runoff going into the dens. So we had a lot more of these ground dens. The size of these dens were really just about the size of the bear or a slightly larger. They're going to be using their claws to dig out this cavity. And in this top center one, you can see the large pile of dirt in the center. So where they were digging all of that out. On the picture on the right, you can't really tell in here on this presentation, but you can see the scratch marks all over the back of that cavity.
The rarest of the structural den types, mostly again in Eastern Washington, were rock dens. Had this project lasted 4 or 5 years, we would have told you that bears do not utilize rock dens that we were able to document in Washington. It was actually the second 5 years of the project, for some reason, that rock dens became more common. And so just to highlight the benefits of these long-term research projects, sometimes you're not able to capture them in everything in those small windows.
And the rock dens tended to have the most spiders, I would definitely add.
Keep going, Linz.
So though most of the dens were inside some sort of structure, we did document some bears using just ground nests, where they would make kind of a nest out of vegetation, which is really inside almost every other den. But in these cases, they would just be exposed or under a large tree. So a lot of these, it was interesting to see because a lot of the dens, say like in Western Washington, you would see where the female would go around and clip off all the ferns all surrounding the area, and then she would make this big nest. So some of the areas, some of these ground nests were made out of ferns, some of them were made out of leaves or branches. And then one of our females, we did have one of those nests, sorry, Rich, was in response to a flooding event. And so she got flooded out of her den and then just made that nest afterwards.
Yeah, you can keep going.
So in the early years of the project, we noticed bears reusing dens a lot in subsequent years. Certainly has been documented in other areas, but we weren't really sure how much it occurred here. So we noticed that they were reusing the same dens a lot. And then we documented trends where females would have one den for when she had cubs and then another den for when she had yearlings, and then would kind of go back and forth between those two. And then later, after we had several bears go missing because of collar failures or whatever, we started going back to those dens to see if we could re-find those same bears. And then with this, we not only were able to actually recapture a large number of bears that we had lost, we also noticed family members, mostly female offspring, using the same den as their mom had, and or non-family members. So we would have adult males taking over a den that we had first documented from a female. So it became really common for us to revisit many of those past dens without a known bear inside. And then so in one example, we did have one female where we documented 4 different dens along this ridge line that she used in subsequent years. And then later we went back and we found, you know, an adult female that was related in one of those previously used dens. And then in 1 year, we actually found 2 males in different dens that were right next to each other, just a couple hundred meters down the road, using those old dens as well. So like I said before, though, den reuse has certainly been documented in other research. It's definitely something that we were not really expecting a lot. It has been really hard to quantify because we kind of came on it opportunistically, but so far as we can tell, at least that we've been able to document, probably about 10 to 15% of our den use is reuse. So, you know, one of the things that we think about is, you know, is there some sort of limitation in these areas of good dens, or are they just really, really good dens and everybody wants to fight over them? And so certainly something to think about.
Yeah. So with the cameras, another benefit was that we were able to document other species coming to the dens. In this situation, we have a flying squirrel that's moving about and standing on the den right there. And then just a couple hours later, a pine marten coming through, probably hunting that ground squirrel. So that was kind of cool to see. But we also had other visitations by just about every other carnivore here in Washington, including all of these. The wolverine and wolf tracks mostly were passing through within 100 meters of the den, but none actually approached the den. But with all of the other species, all of them we documented looking into the den and smelling and coming close to the entrance. And we were able to document some interactions.
Yeah, and I would
So
add to
here's,
that. I was
Go
gonna say,
ahead.
I would just add with that, we didn't really have any active wolf packs in this area during this time. So these were kind of movements through the area. I certainly would expect, as you'll see with this next part on coyotes, that we would probably see similar behavior from the wolves as we do with the coyotes.
Yeah. So here's an example of a coyote visiting a den. And we've had dozens of these. So, you know, it's right at the entrance there. So is this coyote trying to draw the female out? Is it trying to figure out if a predatory attempt is worth the risk? Or is it something else? Pretty interesting. Here's another example. Made us wonder if this is a canid tactic. Disturb the den, wait for the adult female to leave with one cub, and then come back and grab the other one. Because as you can see, this one visited the den, and then just a short while later, here comes mom carrying one of the cubs to a different den with another cub actually following in tow, which was probably good for that cub. It's not uncommon for a female bear to have several dens within a few hundred yards of any den that they're occupying. So they may use these as backup dens in disturbance situations like these, and forest cutting and hunting and all of these other things that can result in disturbance to the den. So that was pretty interesting to see. And then here's one to look. It's going to be hard to see, but this is a mountain lion. You'll see its head come up here, but approaching the den, very close to the den entrance, moving real cautiously, definitely using its sense of smell. That cougar did not go in. But in another example, and I had mentioned this to Garcelis and Proctor a couple years ago, we visited a den to recollar a 3-year-old bear. And when we got about 200 yards from the den, we started seeing cougar tracks, and we followed those cougar tracks right to the den. And when we got there, we discovered there was an altercation at the entrance of the den, and there was an open wound on the abdomen of the young bear, but otherwise she defended herself and was fine. So these interactions do occur, and we were able to document a couple of them. And then here's one of a male bear next to coyotes. Bears were probably the second most common visitor. Watch this bear as it turns the corner. And right there is when he now has made contact with that female, but nothing else happened. And he's just kind of slowly walked away, and she didn't come out to challenge him. We weren't able to say if this was a relation. Best we could tell, it was not. But so there are some social dynamics that are occurring on the landscape. And again, these long-term studies can really highlight some of this stuff. So our plan is really to put this data to use, incorporate this into our species management plan that's being developed for black bear. We hope to publish at least 3 or 4 publications, maybe more. We're going to share this data with other land and forest managers, both in the private and public sectors, and then use this information to fine tune our education and approach to outreach. No, that's not good. So some lessons learned. We've just got a few slides we want to share before we wrap up. Some of the things we do know that this is one of the most invasive things we can do as researchers. And so Lindsay and I would recommend all of you ask, if you're going to do this, how invasive do you have to be? And then how critical is it to handle those newborns? You know, consider cameras to count newborns to reduce disturbance. They work great. We recommend 3 because you're never 100% where the entrance is. Plus they can get hit. Bears come visit those and swat them. And it's always good to have a backup. But you do have the added benefit of documenting other animals, which is neat. And then those site characteristics that you don't see in winter, like what's the understory? If it's developed, most of the times you can document that. But if it's not, you could be missing some things. And then when it comes to collaring yearlings, it does come with additional concerns. We recommend a 1-ply spacer in case of failure instead of a 2-ply, depending on the habitat types that you're in. That was good for both the wet and dry parts of Washington. recollar those animals that winter. So maybe 10 months from the first time you put that collar on. So you need to factor in additional staff time. And then using a 1D battery versus a 2D battery, making the collar lighter. You can also alter the width of the collars. And as we showed, with that 300-pound female, in those situations where they're getting access to human supplied foods, maybe it's best not to collar those yearlings because the growth potential is pretty big. Go ahead, Linz.
Yeah, so just some considerations for the den approach. So obviously, I think a lot of people think that bears are, and maybe not everybody here, but a lot of the general public thinks that bears are just, asleep and unaware during their denning period. But all of these bears are immediately aware of our presence. We certainly had a number of instances where the bears ran away before we even got there. So certainly have it be of your mind that these bears are going to be aware of you as soon as you start approaching the den. So keep the number of attendees to an absolute minimum. I know that, this is it's a pretty cool thing, and it's certainly been really, really special to be involved with, but bringing large groups of people is a huge disturbance to these sensitive areas. We always try to approach downwind just to, keep our approach so they wouldn't know that we were coming. We would load our darts beforehand, so we generally had a pretty good idea of how big the females were going to be. We had a pretty good idea of how many yearlings there might be. So if a female had 2 cubs the previous year, we'd bring a couple of darts for yearlings. That way we weren't trying to figure out dosage and stuff after we had already looked into the den. We would always just have 1 or 2 people going in the last about 50 meters to dart. So usually that was Rich and I using hand signals to communicate rather than talking, just trying to be as quiet as possible. Because when you're in the den and people are walking around outside, you can actually hear a lot, even though a lot of times they're underground or in a structure. And then avoid shining the light in the bear's eyes. So we have to use a pretty strong flashlight to be able to see in there and know where we're darting, but they get pretty pissed off if you start shining the light in their eyes, and they're much more likely to try to leave.
Yeah. And if you ever get into a spot where you're going to investigate a den in the wintertime and it happens to be empty, jump inside there and have the person with you walk around. It is incredibly loud. A lot more than I would have thought. And then as far as immobilization considerations, we would recommend mobilize that female first and then wait. Very often, and Lindsay did this a lot, just gently hand injecting those yearlings. I mean, they could be 40, 50 pounds and they are terrified, and they're kind of looking away from you and not wanting to look you in the eye. And a lot of times you can just hand inject a ½ cc in there. Just consider only removing the females if absolutely necessary. We always tried to avoid work up at the den entrance because all of those scents right there could be a disturbance to the animals. And then regardless of what happened, we always returned the den to its original condition. Like Lindsay said previously, those tree boughs can really help avoid collapse, and it provides a little bit of material for them if they want to pull it in there, but it gives you a good base to really pack in that snow without it falling in. And then as far as scheduling order, recollar those pregnant females maybe a month before they give birth, and then place cameras to avoid disturbance of the newborns. Recollar subadults and adult males after that. Then recollar those females with yearlings as winter is moving into spring. And then for females that don't need to be recollared, you can hang cameras late season in late winter when they have more investment in the offspring, and any moving around is unlikely to result in them abandoning. And then visit the dens where no collar or recollar is needed after den emergence to record those den characteristics and get all of that understory vegetation. It really paid off. Lots of acknowledgements for folks internally and externally that worked on the project and let us access their lands. So we wanted to mention them. Here's one bear that was in a tree. It was a male, and he was out here on this island, and the only way to access him was via a river trip. And so we had a lot of interesting situations. That was a pretty big den. That was about I don't know, maybe a 260-pound male. And we'll take any questions. That's all we have. Thanks everybody. Okay. Chris, are you still on?
Do you want to answer the question in the chat first?
Sure. Okay, so they were asking, the first one, Lindsay, was what kind of drug were we using? And we were actually using BAM for the overwhelming majority. It was great. We did wind up, and we shared this with some folks on this call, we did wind up developing our own dosage chart. It was a little bit different than what the company recommended, but fully reversible and not that dissociative drug. And we actually preferred it quite a bit, so we were using BAM.
Yeah, we used ketamine, xylazine at first, but we had a couple of instances where it took the animals so long to recover, and they were pretty disoriented that we were not super happy in the recovery, and we didn't really have that with BAM.
Yeah,
Yep.
I asked that question in relation to thermoregulation too. So that was, because xylazine usually limits that, and that's why I was kind of curious.
Yep. Yep. And then someone asked if bears moved to a new den with cubs after we visited. Not really. We did have some that moved to different dens, but overwhelmingly, no, they stayed. And I think it was because of the steps that we took. This person said they were from Florida, and it was common for them to move, and cameras might not be as useful. That's a good point.
Yeah, I think in areas, at least from this work, it did seem like in areas that were colder and more snow, that they were potentially more likely to stay put. It was a little bit of a bigger deal for them to move.
Rich, let's take the next question from Sterling. He's got his hand up there.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds a fascinating presentation. And I'd like to say that of all the work I've ever done on bears, going to black bear dens was probably the most fun because we had in Alaska, we had exactly the same kind of diversity in dens that you described, and it never, you never knew what you're going to encounter. So that was fascinating. I had a couple of comments. One is I one time found a very huge den, and I happened across a print of that den the other day. So I will scan it and send it to you, Rich. I would say it was 20 times the size of a bear body mass, or maybe more. And the roof was completely covered in ice crystals. And I have a picture of Chuck Schwartz sitting in that den with enough room to have a party. So I will send that to you. I was quite fascinated. The other thing is that I noticed, and perhaps I missed this because I joined the call late, you were talking about darting bears, but then at the end you said jab sticks on yearlings. So you apparently use both. We use jab sticks always for just, and never use darts. And I kind of wondering why you didn't use jab sticks on the adults in the den. And I'm sorry if you mentioned that and I missed it.
Nope.
The final thing is that I've always wondered, and I had a theory that when females have larger litters, like 3 or 4 offspring, that they keep them with them for longer. And all my evidence for that is anecdotal. And so I could never say it, but you know, just for one black bear example, there, you know, we entered a den that had 3 2-year-old cubs in it, and that was a large litter, and it was really hard keeping the cubs straight, which ones you had jabbed and which ones you hadn't. But it'd be interesting sometime to maybe put together everybody's data in a compendium study and see whether or not there's any truth to that theory that bears keep their cubs with them longer if they have large litters. There was a case on the Alaska Peninsula studied by Lee Glenn and Lee Miller that where they had, I think, 5 cubs, and that female brown bear kept those cubs with her for 4 or 5 years, and they got pictures of them every year, from cubs all the way up to being, I think, 4 years old when they were weaned or something like that.
Okay.
So that's, again, anecdotal, but the idea of somehow doing a composite study like Chuck Schwartz did on his senescence study, that would be perhaps worthwhile for somebody to consider. I guess one more final point is with brown, I never found any mortalities, natural mortalities in black bear dens, although I did find a place where I inferred that a grizzly bear had dug out and killed a black bear. But we did have cases where dens collapsed on brown bears, apparently killing the bear in the den. And we would dig in until we hit fur, just to know that it wasn't just the collar in there and that the bear was dead. But we did find that with brown bears, but never any black bears. And apparently you didn't mention it, so you must not have found that for black bears either.
We didn't.
Answer here. Rich?
Chris, you're broken there, but I'll just answer Sterling's question about the pulse syringe. We never used pulse syringe. It was hand injections with just a syringe in your hand for the yearlings. And what we used was the Dan inject system with the short pole and the little CO2 pistol. In cases where we couldn't reach in and hand inject those yearlings, we used that low impact immobilization equipment. So that was pretty much all we used, was Dan inject or a hand syringe. And then we never did document yearlings staying an additional winter with the females. And as far as movements, Lindsay, you were real intimate with the movement data. Did you notice at all if they were staying longer with females past the breeding season?
No, we didn't really see that, but I would say it seemed like the litters of 3 that we did have, that they were in much worse physical condition than the litters of 2. So it kind of seemed to be a little bit counterproductive, where those litters that were larger were not in as good a shape as those litters that were of 2.
Okay. Chris asked the elevation ranges, and it was, 500 feet in Western Washington, clear up to 6,000 feet in some cases. So they utilized quite a few different elevation ranges. Generally, I would say probably, and Lindsay, you can confirm, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 feet was probably the most common that we did.
Yeah, and we really, we had a pretty big range just in the area that we covered. And so we didn't really see any bears like moving kind of out of their home range for denning. So it was really just kind of representative of what was in their area as well.
Dave, do you have a
Dave.
question?
Okay.
Let's
Sure. Yeah,
try to get Dave's question and then we're going to close. Dave, go ahead, Dave.
okay. Yeah, I was just gonna, just as a comment, just to show that there's a lot of variation in how people go about this, because this was really interesting to hear, because like we've been doing dens since 1981, and we pull all the bears out of the dens. Every bear is drugged except for the new cubs. And sometimes they are a pain to get back in, but we can usually get them back in. We use like a plastic sled to slide them in. We never wake up any of the bears. So, I mean, we don't want the bears to be awake when we leave the den. We want them to just sort of fade back into hibernation. We've used a lot of these heart rate transmitters, and we can tell from the heart rate transmitters when they go back into hibernation. It's usually a few hours after we leave. Almost none of our bears in northern Minnesota reuse their dens, indicating that, you know, for you actually have an issue. I guess it's with the rain or, you know, the wet, and that there's these preferred kinds of dens. You know, we don't have that at all. They den in anything, and it's extremely rare for them to reuse dens. And in fact, it's hard for us to tell. We put a little tag next to the den, like in a tree, just so we can actually tell if it's reused, because sometimes 4 or 5 years later, you know, it doesn't look the same. We're about half and half between darting and jab stick. You know, we spent the first 10 years, there weren't any darts, and we got sort of lazy with the darts being easier. But just as a comment, that it was interesting to hear how different it is in a different area.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I appreciate it. You know, just to be clear on the BAM, you know, when we usually had, it was literally probably 12 to 15 minutes for the reversal to take place. And what we would do is reverse them, come out, pack it real tight, and then hightail it out of there, all within 10 minutes, and be at least a couple 100 yards away before they started coming to. But yeah, we were really impressed with the drug and real happy with it. But there's a lot of them that work. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we used ketamine for a long time with xylazine, and at that time we were happy with it too. But good observations. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and also with the cubs, like we handle all of our cubs, and we haven't seen any indication of females abandoning cubs because they're handled. We actually put them inside of our coveralls, you know, so they're full of human scent.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. And this might be another addition to what Sterling's talking about on, you know, just how cold those winters are. For you, it is a lot different than it is for us. So I wonder if that has something to do with how sensitive they are. I don't know. And a lot of private timber companies, which I'm sure you had too, but there's activity there all winter, and maybe that's part of their adaptation too. I'm not sure.
So we're at the end of our time at this point. So Rich, why don't we stop the reading? If you want to stay, discuss it for the thing to do. So we thank everybody for attending this. That was an excellent seminar, webinar, and a lot of fascinating information. We appreciate it. So
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate everybody joining. If you have to go, we understand. Lindsay and I will stay on a little bit longer, and if anyone wants to stay. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop recording button, and we'll see you soon.